Okay, here's a continuation of the presentation on the CAPA sequence. Now we're going to focus on the last two phases, practice and autonomy. I just want to help you remember that the contextualization phase really establishes the context and the focuses on meaning. The awareness phase starts to bring in the focus on language and helps students through noticing and awareness activities to figure out what the form is and how it works. Then the practice phase, which I'll be providing some examples of here, gives students an opportunity to use that target feature in a more controlled context where they have an opportunity to get feedback. And then the autonomous phase goes back out to meaning, where the students have a communicative task that is developed to get them to show their understandings of content. Again, the emphasis here is on meaning, but they still need to try to use the form within that context. And so again, the focus is on language in the two middle phases. And this corresponds to the Gibbons metaphor of the hourglass that I spoke about before, and this just shows you how this corresponds to that metaphor. All right, so let's move on to the practice phase. Again, I want to remind you that these activities sort of function, all of the language-focused activities function on this continuum, and practice activities are receptive and productive, but much more in the productive mode. Here, the students are producing the form in some controlled way. So these tasks involve practice, and they promote what we call the proceduralization of a form that tend to be avoided, misused, or unnoticed. This is really sort of about automaticity in using. We don't want students to have to sit and think about what that verb ending should be before they produce the correct verb. We want it to become very automatic, right? That's what proficiency is about. It becomes more automatic, so it's not even thought about in any way. And that's what we're really shooting for with these practice tasks. And the idea of practice is engaging in activity with the goal of becoming better at it. Practice doesn't make perfect, but it does make better. So practice in this particular sense is meaningful as opposed to mechanical. So we're not hearkening back to the days of those verb conjugations that are decontextualized and isolated and not meaningful. Practice in this sense is really contextualized again within the content that the students are learning, and so it's much more meaningful. And it is very much communicative. So there is a focus on meaning, while at the same time there's opportunity for practice to be extensive and repetitive. We want a lot of repetition, meaningful repetition, for that form to become automatic or proceduralized. And we want to make sure that there's transfer appropriateness, right? We want to make sure that the practice activity resembles the context in which the learning will be put to use, as I was talking about before. Okay, so these activities provide opportunities for meaningful repetition. So lots of opportunities to produce that form in a rather rapid way, but in a meaningful way that's contextualized within the content. The focus is on accuracy for these activities, and the idea is to elicit the use of these forms through task essentialness. And task essentialness basically means that the task can't be accomplished successfully unless the form is used accurately, okay? And because of that, these kinds of activities often take the form of games with negative consequences, like losing points if you get the form wrong. And these also help to develop metalinguistic awareness, continuing on from awareness activities. Okay, so here are some examples of controlled practice. This was developed by Rayanne Shelley again, that kindergarten example of the I have, you have, we have. She was doing she has earlier, but the students were also using the other form of you have. So she did an inside-outside circle activity, had the students forming two circles, and she gave students varying numbers of the unifix cubes that they can literally link together. So they gave one color of cubes to the students in the inside circle and another color to the students in the outside circle. And students in the inside circle go first, and they state how many cubes they have. Tengo 5 cubos, for example, I have 5 cubes. And then they ask their partner, ¿Cuántos cubos tienes? How many cubes do you have? And then students in the outside circle state how many cubes they have. Yo tengo 6 cubos, for example. And then students will literally, physically connect their cubes with these unifix cubes. And then together they say tenemos 11 cubos. We have 11 cubes. Okay? Make sense? Then a rotating single is given, and the inside circle will rotate one student, and then the process is repeated. So again, this provides for that really nice, meaningful repetition, right? And so I think it's just really kind of a great little activity where it's so contextualized within the content. They're practicing the joining of sets while at the same time practicing those correct verb forms, with only one verb, which is appropriate for kindergarten. And then you could also make this activity into a game in which 2 pairs of students are placed in a group, and one pair listens to the other and fills in a grid. So you have, student A and student B, and then you have I have, you have, we have, and the goal is for each pair to earn as many points as possible for the number of correct verbs used. So they get a point if they use I have correctly, they get a point if they use you have correctly, and they get a point if they use we have correctly. And again, the idea is to repeat this so they keep getting different sets of cubes and so on and so forth. You could set this up in a number of different ways. But what this builds in then is that task essentialness. In other words, it's more of a game here, and there are negative consequences if they don't get the form correct. They don't end up getting a point if they don't get it correct, right? So they're not going to win the game. And so that's the idea here. Again, meaningful repetition and task essentialness. Okay, this was developed by a team of two-way teachers out in Idaho. I forgot to add their names in here, but Gretchen Weber and Rosaline Leon and Gabby. I forget Gabby's last name. I'm so sorry. Oh no, it was Maria Pina. Sorry, it wasn't Gabby. She was in a different group. It was Maria Pina. So they worked together and they were doing this, they were focusing on the Tommy Ungerer books, specifically Crichter, and this was focusing on the adverb endings, ly in English, which they were focusing on during English time, and then mente in Spanish, which is the equivalent to ly in English, to create adverbs. And they had a pile of picture cards from the story Crichter and a word bank of adjectives and adverbs like detailed, pressured, fast, affectionate, curious, immediate, easy, nurturing, okay? And partner A is the judge, and partner B selects one picture card and then chooses an adjective or adverb card from the word bank that correctly describes the picture, and then they have to correctly describe the picture in a complete sentence. So if they can give a correct oral sentence, they earn one token, so that's a focus on content, right? If they are able to produce an oral sentence that accurately describes the picture, they get a token, so that's a focus on content. And then partner B writes the sentence on an erasable sentence strip, and if they can correctly spell the adverb in their sentence, they'll earn an additional 5 tokens. And sorry, I mentioned, yes, this is a focus on content, but it's also a focus on form because they have to produce the adverb in a sentence with the adverb card that they chose. So here you would have to say, something rápidamente, right? And then they get a token if they get this correct. And then they basically earn an additional 5 tokens if they can write out the sentence and spell the adverb correctly, because we know that in both Spanish and English, some of the endings have to change to put that adverb ending on. For example, words that end in Y in English, the Y has to change to an I before adding ly, okay? And so the object of the game is to correctly say and write the adverb in a sentence from the story Crichter. And then this goes back to the Cinderella example where students are going to play a card game in pairs, and each pair receives a deck of 8 picture cards corresponding to Cinderella, and they receive peso coins to use as game tokens that can be won during the game. This just shows you a picture of what they got. And then each pair shuffles the cards and places them in a pile, and the first partner flips over the top card, and they have to describe the story event pictured on the card using imperfect or preterite verb tenses in one complete sentence. And if the student completes the sentence with no errors, he or she earns 1 peso. And if the student makes a mistake that the partner notices and is able to correct, the partner earns 2 pesos. So it really builds in this responsibility for listening to one another, if you will. But again, task essentialness is built in because they have to get it right to get the points and so on. And also you have that meaningful repetition because each time they get a card, they have to produce another sentence with these past tenses. And then the play continues until all the cards have been flipped. And the student with the most pesos at the end is the winner. And then after playing around, students switch partners to play again, thus giving them an opportunity to correct any mistakes they made during the first round. So again, meaningful repetition, but focus on accuracy. Excuse me. And then we go back to also the preterite and imperfect past tenses with the 5th grade example where they were doing biographies. And students were placed in small groups that acted as teams for a game. And then projected on the screen were sentences from a biography of Frida Kahlo with blanks instead of verbs, although the verbs were provided, the actual infinitive of the verb was provided in parentheses. And students were given, had to conjugate the verb correctly using the correct past tense to win a point. And then the team with the most points wins. So here you see an example, de Niña Frida. And, a student would have to say, tenía polio, right? And una de sus piernas no se formó bien, and so on and so forth. And then our last example here goes back to the grade 6 ESL with the participial phrases to express cause and effect. This was a game in teams. The first team, they each got an envelope that had these different pieces, and they had to create sentences that were not only accurate in terms of their content, but also accurate in terms of how they were formed, okay? And then students engaged in a second game. Teams of 5 students were organized and they stood in lines, and the first student in line was up first, and that student had an individual whiteboard and a marker. And the teacher showed a brief video clip depicting the formation of a landform, so how over time a river creates a canyon. And after the video ends, the teacher gives a signal, and the student with the whiteboard on each team needs to race to write an accurate sentence describing what happened in the video. And they have to use that participial phrase to do it well. Make sense? So again, what you're seeing here, and then they get a point for their team. If they don't get it right, either in terms of content or language, they don't get a point for their team. And then it goes to the next person on each team and so on. So you get the sense of these practice activities that they are intended to be very linked to the content, so very much contextualized in that sense, and they need to provide for meaningful repetition and give consequences for not getting the form correct, because the emphasis here is on accurate production of the form. And then finally, the autonomy phase moves us back to meaning again, right? And this focuses on communicative practice activities that are open-ended and meaning-focused. These are tasks that involve task naturalness. So the hope is that the students are going to be able to use the form correctly, but they can still complete the task successfully even if they don't, because the emphasis here is on meaning. And these activities are really designed to develop confidence and motivation in using the second language. They focus on communication. They provide a safe playing field for students to try out communication strategies if they're struggling to be able to produce all of the language. So in this phase, these kinds of tasks allow students to use that second language authentically and purposefully for academic purposes. They create opportunities for in-depth understanding, learning by doing, hands-on experience, but they don't necessarily push students to extend their ability to produce accurate language. Now again, the idea here is because the students have gone through the awareness and practice phases, the hope is that you've raised their awareness of the form. So if the communicative task here in the autonomy phase requires use of past tenses, you're hoping that they're going to get them right, but maybe they don't get them all right, because again, the meaning is on the focus is on meaning. Okay, so here we go with some examples. These examples are typical kinds of activities that we see in most classrooms, including our DLI classrooms. So here's what happened with the fairy tale unit. In small groups, students select a fairy tale and they have to rewrite it by changing characters or events or the ending. And the teacher will have shared The Paper Bag Princess. If you don't know that book, it's terrific, during the unit. And then they're instructed to use preterite and imperfect past tenses, and they get feedback from their teacher and peers during the process. And then the fairy tales are compiled into a book which is shared with grade 2 students. Now, because they're doing drafts, this is a great opportunity for the teacher and peers to provide corrective feedback when it comes to their accurate use of the form. But again, the emphasis here is on meaning. Back to that grade 5 example of the preterite and imperfect past tenses. Again, the biography unit, what they ended up doing here was a wax museum. Students selected a person to research and write a biography about, and they were expected to use preterite and imperfect past tenses. And then they wrote a PowerPoint biography, just about 8 slides, to share during a wax museum performance. Students received feedback from the teacher on drafts of their PowerPoints ahead of time. And then they rehearsed giving their presentation using these slides, and then in costume, the students all showed up in costume, and they gave their wax museum presentations repeatedly to students from other classes and their families and school staff. It was really quite terrific. I was there, and they took over an entire gymnasium, and there were these stations all around with lots of LCD projectors so that kids could share their PowerPoints, and the kids were in costume, and then they would have to freeze in a particular stance. And then somebody would come and they'd want to listen to their presentation, and they would move some kind of musical instrument that the teacher had left on the table, and poof, the wax museum or the wax figure would come to life, and the student would give their presentation in Spanish to the students that were there to listen. It was really, really terrific, and the kids were great. They were really excited about it. Another example of communicative practice comes from that grade 6 ESL, where each student is is assigned to create a poster, an assigned landform or natural force to illustrate what they learned about in terms of how the landform might be created or how the natural force might impact the Earth's surface. They're instructed to use at least one participial phrase showing cause and effect as part of their poster. And then, so that's all of the examples, and this is almost the very last here. I just want to let you know that what the research has shown about these kinds of activities is that the controlled practice activities with the role plays and games, in tandem with the noticing and awareness activities, were more effective than just communicative tasks. So if all we do in classrooms is focus on the contextualization and the autonomy phases, and we skip over the awareness and the practice phases, what the research has shown is that students just don't acquire the forms very well. They acquire the forms better if they have an opportunity to engage in these awareness and practice kinds of tasks. And so it's important to understand that there's really can have an impact on student language acquisition. So these form-focused activities that are different from the other instructional activities. So here we focus in the classroom on meaning, and poof, all of a sudden, I'm now having to focus on form. So it's different from what I'm used to. These are more effective because it's requiring a shift in attention on the part of the students from more meaning to form. And that's the whole idea behind that instructional counterbalance that I started with a little bit earlier. So I hope that this explanation has been helpful to you in understanding the parts of the CAPA sequence and how it's possible to focus on form in a really meaningful and contextualized way to really push forward student language proficiency in the DLI context.